This is a re-recording of the online workshop for TechShare Pro, as the original audio was very poor quality. Hello everybody, good morning, welcome to TechShare Pro Online. This is the workshop on testing voice-powered services for accessibility, and it's also on something called PAS 901 2025. My name is Nick Freear. I'm an accessibility consultant working for AbilityNet. I've been there about 4 years. So the PAS was published in March 2025. This by the British Standards Institute. And that's a QR code in case you want to get access straight away. I should also note that this afternoon there's a panel which is also about accessibility and voice services, and that's being led by my colleague Robin Christopherson, and the other panelists are Bex Brindley from NatWest, Shikha Tiwari from Tata Consultancy Services, Rama Girawo, who's now with Instill and Design for All Europe, and Will Davis from the British Standards Institute. So that's the panel that's going to be on accessibility and voice power services. But back to this workshop. So what I'm going to be covering is where did PAS 901 2025 come from? What is it? Who is it aimed at? Who benefits? How can we test it? And what's next? What is the direction of travel? I should also say at this point, I didn't contribute to or review PAS 901 2025 for publication, and it's copyright the British Standards Institution 2025. Just some acknowledgements. So the lead author was a guy called Andy Heath at Axelrod Access for All. The main sponsors were the Royal College of Art, the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design, and Tata Consultancy Services. Other sponsors we've got were Google, the Indian Institute of Technology, Microsoft, and the universities of University College London and University of Law of York, plus some other companies. So, what is the background to the PAS? Well, basically, there's been a big gap in accessibility standards. So until now, that is. So generally, when we talk about accessibility and we talk about accessibility standards like WCAG, we don't talk about motor and mobility impairments. We talk about vision, people who are blind, people have low vision, people who are colorblind. We do talk about communication, but mostly from the point of view of hearing impairments. And then we'll talk about cognitive learning impairments, and talk about mental health and so on. Yeah, so as I say, there's been this big gap in terms of the other end of the other end the other end the other end of communication, which is speech. Yes, so there have been gaps in the existing accessibility standards. So the most recent version of the web content, web content accessibility guidelines okay, 2.2. If you do a search for speech or for voice, then you'll find that there are no mentions, and that's been the standard for the last 3 or 4 years now. There are other projects which are to do with speech. So there's a speech accessibility project at um, uh, uh, um, at the university at the university at the university at the University of Illinois, um, which has been collecting samples of non-typical speech. There's also Project Euphonia, which was sponsored by Google, and that was doing it. That's one looking at a similar thing, that is using samples of non-typical speech to improve improve the speech recognition software for the major vendors and so on. But there's obviously been this big gap in the standards. So we have the PAS. Who are the groups that may benefit? So we've got generally disabled and neurodivergent people. We've got older users in general, people with developmental speech disfluency, things like verbal dyspraxia and cluttering and stammers and stutters. And obviously, I'm the last category with a stammer. People with Tourette's and vocal tics in general. Then we have people with acquired speech disfluency, either from traumatic brain injury or from things like strokes, Parkinson's, and motor neuron disease. So we have things like aphasia, verbal apraxia, dysarthria, cerebral palsy. I've already mentioned brain injuries. And then we have some people who are non-verbal, and finally we have non-native speakers. So those are the people who may generally benefit from a standard to speech accessibility. What are the technologies that are covered? So we have everything really from automated telephony systems, smart speakers, the whole of the internet or web of things, things like smart TVs, smart washing machines and so on, all sorts of speech-enabled chatbots, and speech recognition software on desktop, on tablet and mobile. That includes the third-party software, but also things built in software, but in the operating system. So basically, all sorts of speech enabled mobile apps. And there may be indeed be things that I've missed there, but hopefully you get the general idea. So PAS 901/2025. This is just a quick look at the table of contents. So we've got instructions, scope, references, terms and definitions, and then we've got the main chapters, which are chapters 4 and 5, which are goals and user accessibility needs approach, and chapter 5, which is the general design. And then there are 3 annexes, A, B, and C. So we're going to look at 4 and 5. So section 4 is a goals and user needs approach. And this talks about how to think of and record and specify the goals and the user needs of your customers when you're procuring or you're designing a design a speech-enabled system. It builds on various other standards, including ISO IEC 29138-1 from 2018, which on screen there, obviously a bit of a mouthful. So that's section 4, but actually it's section 5 that we're most interested in, really. So this section 5 has a series of clauses and subclauses, or sections and subsections, and it starts with 5.1 multimodality, 5.2 language, speech processing, voice interaction, feedback, error prevention and error correction, privacy and trust, speech technology services, and 5.8 is training. And just to note that on the right there, we've got the counts of the subclauses in each of those sections. So section 5.1 has six subclauses. 5.4, which is the biggest one, has 19 subclauses, and 5.8 training has only 1 subclause. So I'm just going to look at a few of these subclauses, just so we get a general idea. So section 5.1 was on multimodality, and 5.1.1 is called individualization, and it states, basically just quoting, when delivering electronic information, a system should provide the modalities that best serve the user's needs or preferences in that context, selectable singly and together. So that's saying that where you have a system that's voice enabled, there should also be the option of text input. Basically, that's what we've got there. That one. That's quite straightforward, hopefully you get the idea there. Section 5.3 is on speech processing, and subclause 5.3.6 is speech impairment. Speech recognition and automatic language translation should be performed in a manner that achieves an equal level of recognition and correctness for all speakers, including speakers with impaired speech or specific speech disabilities. Again, that's hopefully fairly straightforward. You can see what that's getting at. So it's basically saying that if you've got a speech impairment, like a stammer, then software should behave as well, and you shouldn't be at a disadvantage. The next one we're going to look at is interesting. It's to do with time. So subclause 5.4.16, support for conversational interactions hyphen interrupting a user, I should say. And so quoting again, product systems or services accepting vocal input or supporting vocal interaction should provide sufficient time for a user to speak and not respond before presuming an utterance is complete. And there I've highlighted sufficient time. There's no specification of what a sufficient time should be, but basically it's saying that a system shouldn't system system shouldn't interrupt the user there. That's what 5.4.16 is saying. So that was just a few of the subclauses from part 5 of PAS 901/2025. Just because it's useful, here is a link to the PAS on the British Standards Institute website, and here's a QR code. And just to be aware, if you go there, what you'll want to do probably is to click on a link at the top, which says it's to download a non-DRM version of the PAS, and you'll have to fill in a short form, but that is a way of getting a non-DRM version of the PDF of PAS 901/2025. Earlier, I talked about the fact that the current web standards WCAG 2.2 don't make any mention of speech or voice, but we do actually have WCAG 3.0, which is coming down the road, and that's in draft form at the moment. And I'm pleased to say that does mention speech and voice input. So in the draft, it is only a draft at the minute, guideline 2.4.4 is on speech and voice input, and it says that you should provide alternatives to speech input and facilitate speech control. And quoting again, so we call it a foundational requirement. Speech alternatives. Speech input is not the only way of achieving any functionality, except where a speech input is essential to the functionality. So that's WCAG 3, which, as I say, is in draft form. So the most recent draft is from 2025, but that's not expected to be finalised and published until the 2030s. So there's still some time, and so we still need this new PAS 901/2025. And so we come on to what I hope is a constructive critique. And I hope you take this critique in the spirit that PAS 901/2025 is a really important and valuable step for vocal accessibility, and so that's the spirit in which I'm raising these criticisms. So the first critique I've got is that the standard is not open. So as I say, it's published in PDF format, on HTML, and that means you can't link deep inside the pass, inside the guidelines, in the same way as you can with with WCAG 2.2, where you can link to a specific success criteria. So it's PDF and PDF, and not only that, unfortunately, it's untagged PDF, so it won't be accessible to people who need who use people who use people who use assistive technology. It's restricted access, so you either need to fill in a form, or you need to create an account on the BSI shop, and add the pass document to your basket and check out. It is free. There's no cost to it, but you have to go through that process. Also, it has closed governance. So the first time that people realised that it was being produced was when it was published in March 2025. So those are the ways in which I would say it's not so open. It's not open, and these have various consequences. I think they risk siloed thinking. The code of practice, or the PAS, is not free to share in blogs or to create bug reports to improve or reuse. So, for example, I have created bug reports on GitHub, which reference specific success criteria within WCAG 2.2, and in that context, I'm free to quote. I'm free to quote to WCAG, and as I say, you can deep link from the bug reports. You're right to the specific success criteria, which obviously really helps the people reading the bug reports to understand the background to it, and why they should fix it. Indeed, so as I say, all those restrictions on it not being open are likely to restrict usage and uptake. That's my first critique. My second one. So section 5, which is the main one we looked at, it has 60 subclauses, that is 60, and that is similar in scale to WCAG 2.2 levels A and AA. So that's the levels at which we normally test, normally produce an audit. And if we were going to test a system for speech accessibility, we would presumably have to test against all those section 5 subclauses, plus potentially the whole of WCAG 2.2, level A and AA. So that'd be an awful lot of testing that we have to do if we include both those. And there's no concept at the moment within the PAS, within the code of practice, of different priority levels, A and AA and AAA, for example, as you see in WCAG. So obviously that may not always be the system in WCAG, may not always be an ideal system, but it is helpful to provide the different levels, give people an idea of the severity of the different issues that are being raised in an audit, in testing, and those points will have some consequences. So different organisations will have to research and assign priorities. As I say, you presumably would have to test against all of those 60 subclauses plus WCAG. And again, that is likely to restrict usage and uptake. So a third critique is about objectivity and testing. And simply we're asking, can the subclauses be objectively testing? And was testability and measurability considered when developing the PAS, the code of practice? And the answer is there are some things that can be tested straightforwardly, in an objective way, I think. But there were a number of subclauses. So we looked at the one to do with time, provide enough time. And in that case, there was no suggestion of what the timeout, what the threshold should be. And there is a subclause 5.5.3, which is called fairness. And it simply states that systems should behave fairly with regard to to protected characteristics. And whilst that's a very laudable subclause, that's really the overarching purpose of the whole of the PAS and the whole of WCAG, and other standards, and other laws. So that in itself is not really a testable statement because it doesn't go into the specifics of what, of how to define behaving fairly and so on. And again, I think there are some consequences there that it would make testing and auditing difficult with the current state of the PAS and the code of practice. And again, this is likely to restrict the usage and uptake of PAS 901 2025. So I hope that was useful. That was just some critiques, which, like I say, hopefully will be of benefit to you. Briefly, I'm just going to go on now to how to actually perform testing. And this is very much a work in progress, but just a few thoughts. So there are some subclauses which are clearly binary, so they are a simple pass or fail. So as I say, the first subclause we looked at was 5.1.1. Which is which is individualization, and the question there is: does the system offer multiple modalities? And hopefully that's quite a simple one to judge just by exploring the system, and you can assign a pass or a fail. There are some subclauses, as I've said already, that do require some judgment. So, for example, 5.4.16, which we looked at, we have to make a judgment of how much is sufficient time. I'm presuming that's going to vary from person to person, and so is actually all about being able to set the timeout in that case. Another aspect of testing, the testing speech recognition, as an example, which obviously is a major part of this, requires a user input, which I put in quotes there, which basically requires a user to be present. That's if you can contrast it with WCAG, so say for example you test a color contrast, so the contrast is an intrinsic property of the page or the app you're testing, the text and the background of that page or different parts of it. And so you can test that using third-party tools, software and so on, and basically without having a user present. You can just test it as a thing on its own. But in this case, speech recognition, in order to test it, you would require some sort of user input. So does that mean that the tester has to mimic some sort of some sort of non-typical speech. So you have to have a tester who doesn't themselves have a stammer. Do they have to mimic some sort of stammer or stutter or cluttering, or slow speech or other type of thing? And that would be very obviously that wouldn't be appropriate at all. So that would be out of the question. So that got me and some colleagues thinking, and would you have some sort of sample there, some sort of bank therefore of standardized audio samples? And earlier we heard about the speech accessibility project in the States, which is actually collecting a bank of these audio samples, and that's being used to improve speech recognition. So it's possible to think of a similar bank of samples that would be used to test speech recognition. But as anyone who knows anything about testing knows, you have to make sure that the samples that are used to improve speech recognition would not also be used for testing. So it would not all be also be used for this auditing stage that we're talking about now. But also you'd have to restrict access in some way. So in terms of data protection, in terms of protecting people's privacy, you'd have to restrict access, I think, because now we very much have this danger of speech cloning, which would be a horrible thing to think of. In the case of non-typical speech, if it's done without the person's consent. But yes, that may be a way forward, but I think it would be very hard to achieve. And then you've got the third approach, where you would have some sort of user testing. So basically, you would test the real users. So in this case, as for the second point, you would just have to find a sample of of people with various types of non-typical speech, and ask them to perform some tasks in the same way as you do any sort of user testing, really, and ask their feedback, on what they're finding. And so all this brings me to a fourth point. I've called this a challenge. So it's not a critique of the past of the code of practice specifically. It's actually more about this whole area of testing. So it's asking the question: does the tester need to produce stammers, slurred, slowed, fast speech, and other disfluencies in order to test? And how do you produce in a measurable and objective fashion, and a standardized fashion, minor and significant failures of speech recognition, which is what various subclauses talk about. And generally, how do you produce, how do you undertake repeatable testing, so that if you do testing later on, or someone else does testing on the same system, you get the same results, assuming there've been no improvements, or the system hasn't got worse. So that's basically a challenge that we have. So briefly, just to look at what are the next steps that we could think of. So in the light of, I think there's so many good ideas, in the PAS, in the code of practice. There's so much valuable stuff there. What I would propose is that we set up some sort of community group, which can be set up within the W3C, and its remit, I'm proposing, would be to explore republishing PAS 901/2025 in a totally open format. So as basically as a group note, which is a very standard thing, basically anyone can set up anyone can set up a community group as part of the W3C. So the lowest level on a topic. I'm proposing that they would basically republish the existing existing code of practice in full, in an open format, so that it can actually be used, and it could be researched and people can explore how to use it for testing, how useful it was, are there any flaws in it, are there any improvements that can be made. That would obviously need the permission and the support of the existing sponsors and partners. So people like the Royal, people I mentioned, people like the Royal College of Art and Tata Consultancy Services and the British Standards Institute. And indeed, it'd be interesting to see if the BSI and the other partners would be willing to collaborate in that group as part of the W3C process. And then after republishing, I'm also suggesting that we can look at working together on a new, perhaps slimmer and more testable version of that path, of that code of practice. And that would be really, I think, that would be really useful ways we can take what's been done so far forward. So thank you for listening. That's all I have to say today. So now we've just got some links to various resources that were referenced throughout this talk. Thank you for listening. Any questions or comments? And there you see my my profile on LinkedIn and my email address, nick.freear at abilitynet.org. Thank you very much.